Speaker Mike Johnson mocked Jasmine Crockett before the nation, calling her dignity worthless. She fired back with a $100 million strike that shook Washington to its core. Explosive evidence, a global firestorm, and a verdict that shattered America. What destiny now awaits Mike Johnson? Stay with us, this is a story worth every second of your time. The United States Capitol blazed under harsh white lights, every shadow cut sharp, every sound magnified. The hearing chamber was packed, and tens of millions of Americans, especially older viewers at home, watched in absolute silence. The air was heavy, suffocating, the kind of silence that made hearts pound louder than words. Everyone knew this was not routine politics. This was about survival, pride, and the fight for dignity. Jasmine Crockett sat tall, back straight, her hands resting on a thick folder stacked like ammunition. Her eyes were unwavering, filled with steel, ready for the blow she knew was coming. Across from her, Mike Johnson reclined in his black suit, a smirk carved into his face. His stare was cold, calculating, announcing without words, "I own this stage." The banner above declared ethics in politics and responsibility in speech. But the truth was clear, this was not theory. This was war. The gavel cracked bang, and every camera zoomed in. The gavel's echo still lingered when Johnson leaned forward, his eyes locked on Jasmine, and the air inside the chamber seemed to drop a degree colder. He did not touch the subject of the hearing, not one word about ethics or responsibility. Instead, he turned his whole body toward her, his jaw tightening, his voice dropping into a sharp growl that carried across the room. Each word landed like a punch, cruel and deliberate. "Crockett," he said, "you are nothing more than a stain on this Congress, a disgrace in a black suit, a cheap reminder that the lowest bloodlines can sometimes crawl their way in here." He didn't stop there. His lips twisted into a sneer as he went on, louder this time, so even the last row could hear. "You are not worthy to sit at this table. You don't belong among us. Without politics, you'd be pouring coffee in the hallway, grateful just to serve the real decision makers. You have no value, no purpose, no meaning here. Your only contribution is to be a laughingstock for America." The words were venom, calculated not to debate, but to humiliate, designed to break her in front of the cameras. The room froze. Lawmakers who had sat through countless arguments and insults suddenly looked stunned, mouths half open in disbelief. One older congressman clenched his fists against the desk so hard his knuckles turned white. A woman in the back row covered her mouth in shock. The sound of pens scratching halted. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate, zooming out to capture the faces in the room, faces etched with disbelief and outrage. The silence stretched heavy and unnatural, as if time itself refused to move forward. In the center of it all sat Jasmine. She did not flinch. She did not lower her eyes. She sat like a statue carved from steel, her folder closed in front of her, her hands steady. Her gaze never left Johnson's, unblinking, steady, relentless. 10 seconds ticked by, long enough for millions watching at home to feel their lungs tighten. 10 seconds of silence, and the world seemed to stop. Viewers on television leaned closer to their screens, waiting, holding their breath, knowing something explosive was about to come. Then Jasmine rose. The scrape of her chair against the floor cracked the silence like a gunshot. Her voice cut through the chamber, firm and thunderous, echoing against the marble walls. "The darkness you just named will cost you $100 million, she declared. "I will sue you for your public insult, for humiliating my dignity, and for trying to destroy my career." Her words rang like a verdict already delivered, bold and unshaken. The power in her voice filled every corner of the chamber, leaving no doubt that she was deadly serious. The reaction was instant. The chamber erupted in gasps and frantic whispers. Lawmakers leaned toward each other, whispering in disbelief, while reporters scribbled furiously, pens scratching across notepads as if trying to catch fire. The sound of cameras snapping was relentless, like a storm of flashbulbs capturing the moment history cracked open. Outside the chamber, the digital world exploded. Phones buzzed as her words spread like wildfire within minutes. Jasmine's declaration was already rippling far beyond those walls, out into every living room in America. Johnson didn't retreat. He laughed instead, a sharp, bitter sound that cut through the noise. He jabbed a finger across the table at Jasmine, his smile now twisted into open contempt. "You can sue," he spat, "but you will never get a dime from me. Not 1 cent. Do you hear me? Not one." His challenge was defiant, arrogant, dripping with the confidence of a man convinced that power would always shield him. The laughter that followed was hollow, but it carried slicing through the chamber like broken glass. The chair slammed the gavel down, demanding silence. His voice strained to bring the room back to order. But the damage had already been done. The chamber had turned into a battlefield, and the battle lines were now drawn. Cameras stayed locked on Jasmine and Johnson, refusing to look away. Millions of Americans, their hearts racing, knew they had just witnessed the spark of something that would not end in that room. The earthquake had begun, and its shockwaves were already spreading across the nation. The gavel's crack was still echoing in the chamber when the room emptied into chaos. Reporters rushed through the double doors, cameras slung on shoulders, voices rising as they shouted updates into phones. Outside vans with satellite dishes hummed, ready to beam breaking news across the country. Within minutes, television screens from coast to coast replayed the same moment: Johnson's insult, Jasmine's silence, and her thunderous vow to sue for $100 million. Networks cut and spliced it again and again, building it into a loop that felt less like politics and more like a cinematic dual broadcast live. The world was no longer just watching, it was replaying every second, hunting for the exact instant the balance of power shifted. By evening, the coverage had escalated into nonstop specials. Anchors leaned forward over their desks, their voices sharp with urgency as they replayed the video side by side with historical cases. Legal analysts filled the screens, their expressions grave, their words heavy. Again and again, one case resurfaced: the Dominion lawsuit against Fox News in 2023. $787 million, one commentator emphasized, tapping the desk. That number is burned into the memory of America, another added almost with a smirk. If Dominion can take down a media empire, Crockett can absolutely take down the Speaker of the House. The line was repeated across channels, gaining weight with each repetition until it felt like a prophecy. Viewers across the country absorbed every word. In small-town diners, older men set down their coffee mugs to argue over what they'd just seen on television. In church halls, groups of women gathered, their voices rising in disbelief and admiration for Jasmine's composure. On golf courses, retirees paused mid-game, their conversations no longer about strokes but about lawsuits and dignity. "It feels like history repeating itself," one man said in front of his Sunday group. First Fox, now this. She's not just fighting for herself, she's fighting for all of us who've been dismissed and disrespected. Heads nodded around him, the sentiment spreading with each retelling. For Americans over 50, the memory of Dominion was still fresh, and Jasmine's stand slotted perfectly into that frame of victory. Television crews captured these reactions, cutting them into montages of ordinary Americans reacting to an extraordinary confrontation. The contrast was striking: lawmakers frozen in silence inside the Capitol, and citizens roaring with opinion outside in diners, homes, and town squares. The clash was no longer confined to the marble halls of Congress. It had spilled into living rooms, neighborhoods, and communities across the nation. Every replay of Johnson's sneer, every clip of Jasmine's defiant vow fed into the storm. The sense was undeniable. This was not just a headline. This was the beginning of a saga that would test the limits of power and justice. And as the news cycle spun faster, one message rang louder with every broadcast: the battle that had ignited under the Capitol dome would not die there. It was only the opening scene of a larger war. The fight was moving beyond speeches, beyond insults, beyond cameras in a hearing room. It was shifting onto a new battlefield, one where words would be weighed as evidence and pride would carry a price tag. The confrontation was headed for federal court, and the whole nation knew it. The storm that began inside Congress now shifted to the solemn halls of federal court. The case was stamped Crockett versus Johnson, and from the first morning, it was clear this would not be an ordinary trial. The courtroom overflowed with reporters, their cameras flashing in bursts, their laptops clicking like a drumline. Every seat was taken, from the polished wooden benches at the back to the jury box packed with citizens who could feel history pressing down on them. Viewers at home tuned in by the millions. It wasn't just a trial, it was America on the edge of its seat. Jasmine entered with her legal team, her expression firm, shoulders squared. Across the aisle, Johnson strode in with forced confidence, his suit crisp, his smirk rehearsed but his eyes restless. The judge reminded the room that order must be maintained, But even he knew control would be tested. This was not about legal jargon or footnotes. This was about whether words could destroy dignity and whether power could insulate cruelty. The stakes felt carved into stone, and the silence before arguments began was thunderous. Jasmine's attorney wasted no time. He clicked the remote, and the courtroom screens lit up with the footage. Everyone remembered Johnson leaning forward, voice sharp and dripping with contempt. "Crockett, you are nothing more than a stain on this Congress. A disgrace in a black suit. Without politics, you'd be pouring coffee in the hallway." Gasps rippled through the audience as if hearing it again for the first time. The lawyer turned back to the judge and the jury. "This is not politics. This is not debate. This is a deliberate public attack on dignity crafted to humiliate broadcast live to millions. The damage to her career is real. The damage to her reputation is measurable. This is not free speech. This is destruction." His words struck with the weight of a hammer, and Jasmine sat unmoving, her eyes fixed forward, a symbol of quiet resolve. Johnson's team rose quickly, pushing back with a confidence that seemed brittle under the lights. His lead attorney adjusted his glasses, voice sharp but defensive. "The First Amendment protects opinion even when it is offensive. These are political words, nothing more. They are not actionable insults, but protected speech in the heart of America's democracy. My client's remarks may have been harsh, but they are political commentary, not personal defamation." The defense leaned heavily on freedom, their voices rising with every phrase, hoping the jury would see this as an overreach. Johnson leaned back in his chair, nodding as if convinced his shield of power still held. But Jasmine's team had prepared for this moment. Her attorney stepped forward again, eyes locked on the jury, and pressed play on another clip. The screen now showed Johnson in 2021, standing in the House chamber, sneering as he attacked Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. His voice echoed through the courtroom. "You are nothing but a radical bartender pretending to be a lawmaker. You don't deserve this seat, you never have, and the House is weaker because of you." The reaction was immediate. The audience stirred, whispers broke into audible outrage. A few in the gallery shouted their anger, bursting past the judge's command for silence. The judge slammed the gavel, his voice booming. "Order! This court will have order." But the seed was planted. This was not a one-time slip. This was a pattern. The prosecution pressed harder. This is not isolated. This is not political debate. This is a repeated tactic, a weapon of humiliation aimed at women in power. Today it is Representative Crockett. Before it was Representative Ocasio-Cortez. And tomorrow it will be another. This is not free speech. This is a strategy. The jury shifted in their seats, some leaning forward, brows furrowed. The tension in the air was electric, a storm waiting for the next lightning strike. And then it came. Jasmine's attorney clicked to the next slide, and on the screen appeared the damning words pulled from an email Johnson had sent his closest advisor. The attorney read it aloud, his voice steady, every syllable landing like a bullet. "We must silence the voices of progressive women of color, or they will overwhelm us." The courtroom exploded. Gasps, shouts, the scrape of chairs as people half rose in disbelief. One woman in the gallery covered her face with both hands. At the back, a reporter muttered, "Oh my God," before furiously typing the headline of his career. Johnson's attorneys froze, their rehearsed calm shattered. Johnson himself stiffened, his smirk gone. His jaw clenched so tight the muscles twitched. Behind him, a row of lawmakers shifted uncomfortably, some lowering their eyes to the floor as if distance could save them. The judge pounded his gavel again and again, his voice raised to restore order, but the chaos rolled on like thunder. The room was no longer neutral ground. It was a battlefield drenched in the shock of revelation. And as the echoes faded, one truth hung heavy in the air. This was no longer about a single insult. It was about intent, about a calculated plan to break a woman in public. The trial had crossed a line, and the entire nation could feel it. The last syllable of the email faded from the speakers, and the courtroom forgot to breathe all at once. Then the air thickened, heavy and hot like a storm building in place over polished wood and glass. Reporters lunged for the aisle, shoving open the doors, phones already lit in their hands, their press badges swinging. They texted and typed in a frenzy, blasting out the banner, "Email racist leak" in bold caps. Camera crews spilled into the corridor, calling editors, staking corners for live shots. Inside, those who remained sat rigid, the silence loud enough to sting. Johnson's lead attorney rose, smoothing his tie, as if that could smooth the damage, as if fabric could mend torn credibility. He cleared his throat, reached for a polished calm, and spoke in a measured tone that did not reach his eyes. If anyone feels offended, Mr. Johnson also regrets it. He tried to frame the email as context, the language as heat of the moment, the intent as misunderstood, and tried to bury intent beneath procedure. His words floated weakly, unable to fill the gap. Evidence had blown open, collapsing midway between the podium and the jury. The judge watched in silence. The jury watched, the lawyer watched the floor, and even the court reporter paused before her keys resumed their clatter. Jasmine stood without hurry, a quiet line of steel in the center of the room, anchored to the floor, unmovable. Her voice was steady, cutting through the leftover murmur carrying to the back row. Apologies cannot mend a plan. Apologies do not erase a scheme, and the law will price this humiliation. Every gaze locked on her. Even skeptical reporters nodded as the weight settled and the tilt of justice became visible, like a scale slowly tilting that no one tried to push back. The courtroom had barely settled from the chaos of the leaked email when Jasmine's attorney rose again, his voice steady but sharp as a blade. Your Honor, the plaintiff calls a new witness. Heads turned, a ripple of whispers racing through the gallery as the heavy doors creaked open. Stepping forward was Daniel Reeves, a man once known only as a quiet aide in Mike Johnson's inner circle. His suit looked pressed but ill-fitting, his hands trembling slightly as he carried a slim folder pressed tight to his chest. Reporters gasped. Cameras, tilted pens scratched. Everyone knew what it meant when a loyal aide walked into court holding evidence. The bailiff led Reeves to the stand. He raised his right hand, swore his oath, and sat down. His jaw clenched like a man carrying both shame and fury. His voice cracked at first, then steadied. I work directly for Mr. Johnson, he said, eyes darting briefly toward his former boss. And I was present when this was written. He tapped the folder in his hands. This is a memo drafted days before the congressional hearing with Representative Crockett. His words dropped like bombs. The courtroom tightened. Even the judge leaned forward. Jasmine's attorney stepped forward, took the folder from Reeves, and carefully unfolded the pages as if they were dynamite. The attorney held the document high. This, he announced, voice low, but pulsing with force, is an internal memo circulated among Johnson's top advisors. Its purpose was not policy. Its purpose was not debate. Its purpose was character destruction. He opened to the first page and began to read. Strategy: humiliate Crockett on live television to cripple her credibility and destroy her political standing. Murmurs exploded through the gallery. The jury stiffened and Johnson's attorneys shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Jasmine sat silent, her eyes fixed forward, a statue carved in fire. The attorney's voice grew louder as he flipped to the second page. This is not suggestion. This is not rhetoric. This is a plan. He paused, then stabbed his finger at a line printed in bold, circled in thick red ink. He read each word like a hammer on stone. Objective: turn Crockett into a national joke. Attack her roots. Attack her gender. Attack her race. The words cracked across the chamber like lightning. A woman in the gallery gasped, "Oh my God," loud enough to echo. Reporters nearly toppled over each other, cameras strobing like gunfire. The memo's venomous intent was undeniable, black letters on white paper, as cold and brutal as any confession. The judge's gavel hovered but did not strike. He knew the silence that followed was louder than any order he could give. Daniel Reeves lowered his head, his voice trembling again. I left Johnson's office the day that memo was finalized. I couldn't be part of it. They laughed as they drafted it. They called it a smear script. They knew exactly what they were doing. His confession was a knife twisting deeper, dragging the courtroom further into the abyss of premeditation. Johnson's face drained pale, his fists clenched white on the table, lips pressed so tight they nearly disappeared. Jasmine's attorney slammed the memo down on the evidence table. This is not free speech, he thundered. This is not opinion. This is premeditated humiliation. This is an assault weapon made of words designed and deployed to annihilate a colleague's dignity before the nation. His hand swept toward the jury, and it was orchestrated by the man sitting right there. Every camera in the room pivoted, zooming tight on Johnson's face. The once smug grin was gone, replaced by the hollow stare of a man cornered, exposed, stripped of defense. The gallery erupted in chaos. Shouts rose, shame. Others hissed in disbelief. Reporters bolted from the room, yelling into phones. Memo confirms racial and gender attacks planned. The words spread like fire before the trial even paused. Inside, the frenzy only grew, the judge finally pounding his gavel like a drumbeat of thunder. Order, order in the court. But order was impossible. The memo was more than evidence, it was a nuclear detonation. The jurors exchanged glances, their expressions dark and unyielding. Some leaned back, arms crossed, their verdict already written in their faces. Even skeptical journalists in the press row nodded grimly. This was not spin, not interpretation. This was intent carved in ink, undeniable, unforgivable. Daniel Reeves sat hunched, his testimony hanging in the air, like smoke after an explosion. Johnson leaned toward his lawyers, whispering frantically, but their shoulders slumped. There was no argument left, no shield strong enough to hide behind. His eyes darted across the room, searching for sympathy, finding none. Behind him, lawmakers who once stood proudly at his side shifted in their seats, staring at the floor, ashamed to meet the gaze of the public. And at the center, Jasmine remained motionless, her composure unshaken. She didn't need to rise, didn't need to speak. The memo spoke for her louder than any declaration. She sat with her chin lifted, her silence heavier than the roar of the crowd, embodying every person who had ever been dismissed, degraded, or silenced. The judge hammered his gavel again, but the damage was irreparable. The memo was the death blow. Johnson had no defense, no pretense of innocence. The trial had shifted irreversibly, and the scales of justice had slammed downward. In that moment, everyone in the courtroom understood it. This was the decisive strike, the evidence that turned the case into destiny. There was no way back. The courtroom had endured week after week of arguments, cross-examinations, and revelations that cut deeper than anyone expected. Now at last the silence was absolute. The judge re-entered, his black robe sweeping as he carried the verdict in his hand. Every seat was filled, every breath held. The hum of cameras was the only sound, like the ticking of a bomb about to detonate. Jurors sat stone-faced, their eyes betraying nothing, and the gallery leaned forward as if the verdict itself could change the balance of gravity in the room. The weight in the air was suffocating. The judge cleared his throat, his voice echoing off the marble walls. In the case of Crockett versus Johnson, this court finds in favor of the plaintiff. Gasps shot through the chamber, muffled cries puncturing the silence. The judge continued, his words slow, deliberate, final. The defendant, Michael Johnson, is ordered to pay damages in the amount of $100 million. It felt less like a sentence and more like thunder rolling across the courtroom, shaking every listener down to the bone. The verdict was clear. Johnson had lost. Crockett had won. For a split second, the room was stunned into paralysis. Then the division broke open. Supporters of Jasmine Crockett erupted, clapping, crying, clutching one another in disbelief. Tears streamed down the faces of women in the gallery, some whispering prayers, others repeating, "Justice, justice, justice." They embraced each other as if the weight of decades had just been lifted. Across the aisle, the allies of Johnson sat stiff and silent. A few lowered their heads, unable to look at him. Others rose quietly, slipping toward the doors with pale faces and tight lips. Their silence was louder than the cheers on the other side. Johnson himself looked broken. His skin had turned ashen, the smirk that once ruled the chamber replaced with a hollow stare. He staggered to his feet, one hand bracing the table, his steps heavy as though his body no longer belonged to him. Camera flashes stung his face like 1,000 pinpricks, each burst freezing his collapse in high definition. As he neared the door, reporters surged forward, shouting questions like bullets. "Mr. Johnson, do you still have the right to serve as Speaker of the House? Do you intend to appeal? Is your career over?" He said nothing. His head bowed, his lips pressed tight, his shoulders caved inward. He walked like a man retreating into a tunnel with no exit. All eyes then swung back to Jasmine. She stood tall at the plaintiff's table, her expression calm but resolute. No smile broke her face, no arrogance tainted her stance. She stepped to the podium, her voice steady, resonant, carrying across the chamber with the weight of finality. "This is not my victory," she declared, each word like a bell. "This is the victory of truth, and it belongs to every woman who has ever been humiliated, every voice that has ever been silenced. Her words cut deeper than any gavel strike, drawing nods, tears, and a rising chant of approval from her supporters. Even those who had doubted her bowed their heads in acknowledgement. The cameras drank it all in the collapse of power, the rise of dignity, the pivot of history. The contrast was searing, Johnson shrinking beneath the weight of disgrace, while Jasmine rose with the calm strength of vindication. Reporters typed furiously, broadcasting her words into every home, every phone, every screen. Commentators whispered that this was the day the scales of justice tipped publicly, undeniably, irrevocably. The ruling was not only about money, it was about honor, about whether cruelty could be disguised as politics, and whether dignity could finally demand its price. The judge banged his gavel once more, bringing the trial officially to its end. The echoes bounced across the chamber, sealing the moment into history. Johnson disappeared through the side door, trailed by his lawyers, hunched and defeated. Jasmine remained a moment longer, her figure framed against the bench, her voice still echoing in the ears of all who had heard it. The gallery erupted again, a storm of applause, tears, and cameras. No one could leave their seat without knowing they had witnessed a turning point. As the crowd spilled into the hallways, as news anchors scrambled to deliver breaking coverage, one truth was undeniable. The most powerful man in the chamber had bowed to justice, and the name Jasmine Crockett now stood not only for one woman's vindication, but for the principle that even the highest can fall when the truth finally stands tall. The echoes of the gavel had barely faded when the outside world erupted. Within hours, the front pages of America's most powerful newspapers were remade. The New York Times printed its headline in bold, stretched across the fold, "History Rewritten. Crockett wins $100 million against Johnson." The Washington Post followed suit, its headline, "Thunderous, Speaker Defeated, Justice Delivered." Newsstands were cleared before noon, commuters clutching papers as if they were souvenirs from a war won. The story wasn't confined to one corner of politics, it dominated every platform, every headline, every whispered conversation in cafes and subway cars. The judgment was no longer just a ruling, it was a turning point stamped into ink. Cable networks lit up with special coverage, their screens replaying Jasmine's words on a loop. "This is the victory of truth." Legal analysts filled panels, their faces grave, their tones sharp. "We've seen something like this before," one declared, tapping the desk as though hammering the point into stone. Dominion versus Fox News, $787 million. That case made media accountable for lies. But this makes politicians accountable for humiliation. This is a new frontier. Another expert leaned forward, her voice brimming with urgency. "This is a milestone. Free speech has limits, and we just watched the courts draw a line that will reverberate through every campaign, every hearing, every debate from this day forward." The comparison to Dominion spread like wildfire, not only anchoring Jasmine's victory and precedent, but crowning it as a landmark all its own. Advocacy groups seized the moment with both hands. Women's organizations rolled out statements within hours, their words blazing across social media and flashing across scrolling banners on television. Today, one statement read, "The dignity of women in politics is no longer negotiable." Civil rights leaders spoke at rallies, their voices booming through microphones as crowds cheered. "This verdict is more than money, it's a message," one leader shouted. "If you weaponize race and gender to silence someone, you will pay the price." The era of impunity is over. The chant rose from the crowd like thunder. No more silence, no more silence. It wasn't confined to Washington, it was in Chicago, Atlanta, Los Angeles, an echo that spanned the nation. The hashtag #WantYourWomen in Congress exploded across platforms, lighting up Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok feeds. Millions posted clips of Jasmine in court, her words spliced with music, her face set against backgrounds of storms clearing into sunlight. Young women wrote under the tag, "I see myself in her." Law students posted, "This is why I study law." Even older voters joined in, their comments brimming with pride. Finally, dignity wins. The movement turned digital overnight, but its roots were physical marches. Vigils and community gatherings were organized under its banner. The slogan, "Women in Congress." "Women with Power" was printed on posters and waved in the streets. Jasmine's stand had transcended one courtroom. It had become the rallying cry for a generation. But the most haunting and human images didn't come from marble steps or televised panels. They came from living rooms. In a small house on the outskirts of Detroit, a black mother sat with her young daughter on the couch. The glow of the TV lit their faces as the anchor replayed Jasmine's statement. Tears filled the mother's eyes. She pulled her child close, her voice trembling but fierce. "Do you see, baby? Do you see? They cannot silence us anymore." The little girl nodded, her small hands gripping her mother's sweater, her eyes wide as though watching not just news but the future itself unfolding in their living room. That moment was replayed in countless homes, families pausing dinner to watch the broadcast, grandmothers whispering prayers of thanks, fathers squeezing their daughters' hands. The verdict was no longer just about Jasmine, it was about them. Journalists captured these snapshots, weaving them into feature stories. Photographers snapped images of people reading newspapers on park benches, their faces caught between awe and vindication. Editorials poured in, some calling Jasmine a symbol of resilience, others warning that politicians everywhere should now tread carefully with their words. Yet all converged on the same theme: this was a reshaping of the political landscape. A columnist in the Los Angeles Times wrote, "Honor and dignity have finally been given a legal price, and that price is steep." The drama had left the courtroom, but the theater of consequence now played out in the open streets of America. The reaction wasn't confined to allies. Even those once neutral or skeptical found themselves swayed by the gravity of the verdict. A conservative talk show host, long critical of Jasmine, stunned his viewers with a sober admission. "I didn't think she could win, but she did. And maybe that tells us something about where this country is heading." His words, clipped and replayed online, underscored the shift Jasmine's victory had cracked, walls no one thought could move. The drama was no longer about sides. It was about reckoning. In law schools across the country, professors rewrote their lesson plans overnight. Students debated heatedly in lecture halls, dissecting every angle of the verdict. Could insults be measured in dollars? Could humiliation be quantified in damages? The consensus wasn't unanimous, but the energy was electric. "We're watching case law being born," one professor declared, "and you will be the generation that practices under it." The applause that followed wasn't just academic pride. It was the realization that history had shifted under their feet, and they were standing on new ground. Through it all, Jasmine remained steady. She avoided the temptation of victory tours or triumphant sound bites. When pressed by reporters, she repeated the same line. "This was not about me. This was about truth, dignity, and justice." Her restraint only fueled the fire, casting her not as a winner, basking in glory, but as a figure carved in resolve. Commentators marveled at her composure, describing it as the quality that made her more than a plaintiff. It made her a symbol. The public couldn't get enough of her words, her image, her unwavering calm in the eye of a storm. And as days turned into weeks, one message rose above the noise. Dignity and honor were no longer abstract, untouchable ideals. They were rights. They could be defended. They could be vindicated. They could even be given value in court. "Dignity is not a theory," one editorial declared. "It is a principle with teeth, and today it bit back." The line went viral, repeated in speeches, sermons, and school classrooms. It was as though America had found new vocabulary for old wounds. The courtroom battle had ended, but the resonance of Jasmine's victory was only beginning. Every headline, every chant, every whispered conversation carried the same charge: something irreversible had happened. The truth had spoken, the law had listened, and the nation could not unhear it. The roar from the courthouse steps rolled straight up Capitol Hill, and by the next morning, the leadership huddled behind closed doors. Whips counted hands in anxious whispers, while counsel warned that silence now would look like surrender. A motion circulated to convene a special session on the use of hate-laced rhetoric in official proceedings. Senior members' eyes rimmed red from late-night calls, signed on one after another until the clerk's book looked heavy with ink. When the doors opened, microphones snapped to life, and the speaker pro tempore announced a rare emergency debate on language and responsibility in politics. In the Rules Committee, staffers stacked binders and slid fresh draft text onto green felt. The title was plain. The stakes were not special session on hostile speech and ethical conduct. Procedural fights flared time limits. Witness lists, subpoena power, then cooled under the knowledge that the whole country was watching. A bipartisan quorum formed brittle but real, and the schedule was adopted. Outside reporters typed the headline before the vote was even tallied. Congress had been forced to face its own mouth. When the chamber gavels fell, the galleries were packed, and the air felt charged enough to spark. Constitutional scholars took the first chairs and drew a simple line for everyone to see. Criticism is not the same as degradation, and policy debate is not the same as personal demolition. A former parliamentarian testified that rules already banned personalities, but enforcement had withered in the glare of television. A civil rights attorney mapped the harm careers, stalled threats, spiking public trust, cratering when cruelty becomes a tactic. Each testimony landed with the weight of a brick, stacking a wall no one could pretend not to see. Inevitably, one member tried to derail it with theatrics, waving pocket constitutions and shouting about censorship. The gavel cracked, and the chair reminded the chamber that the First Amendment guards citizens from the state, not lawmakers from consequences of their own conduct. Murmurs settled, pens resumed scratching. A veteran from the Judiciary Committee leaned into the mic and said quietly, "We regulate gifts, stocks, and travel. Perhaps it is time we regulate insults that come with a badge." The sentence lingered like smoke, and no one rushed to fan it away. Proposals hit the hopper in careful sequence. A code of conduct update would codify sanctions for identity-based slurs on the floor or in hearings. A graduated penalty system paired fines with mandatory ethics training and temporary committee suspensions for repeat offenses. An independent counsel model, small, fast, and insulated, would review incidents and make binding recommendations within 30 days. A pilot program would roll out for the next session with a public dashboard tracking complaints and outcomes. The words sounded dry on paper. In the chamber, they felt like scaffolding around a damaged house. Beyond the dome, the media fed the nation a steady diet of analysis and memory. Sunday shows ran split screens, Jasmine's verdict on one side, black and white shots of the Watergate hearings on the other. There was a time when an entire country tuned in to watch accountability happen in real time. One anchor said, voice low and reverent. A historian nodded and added, back then it was burglary and lies. Today it is the weaponization of humiliation. The thread is the same power tested by truth. The Chiron underlined it in blunt block letters, from Watergate to Wordgate. Late-night monologues cut sharper than usual, and morning panels went long, bringing in former prosecutors, speech scholars, and etiquette officers from other parliaments. A conservative commentator surprised his own audience by saying, "I don't like new rules, but I like chaos even less. If you can't make your point without shredding a person's humanity, maybe you don't have a point." A progressive host answered, "We all just watched a jury tell the country the same thing, only with a price tag." The debate didn't cool the story. It kept it hot enough to bend. In diners with chrome stools and coffee that never stopped pouring, older Americans pushed their newspapers to the center of the table and pointed at headlines with calloused fingers. "I remember the gavel in '73, one man said, voice rough with memory. "When the country decides to fix something, it can fix it." A woman who had taught civics for 40 years smiled over her glasses and replied, "We taught our students that the rules outlive the rulers. Feels good to see it proven again." They paid their checks and left with papers under their arms, like trophies from a long, hard season. Church basements filled for weeknight gatherings that used to be about bake sales and were now about dignity. A deacon read a passage about the tongue as a fire and then played Jasmine's speech on a portable projector. Heads nodded in rows. A veteran in the front wiped his eye with the back of his hand. "Justice is slow," he said to no one in particular, "but she finds the door." The room hummed with the small, steady sound of faith returning to its seat. On the coast and far inland, retirement clubs swapped bridge nights for town hall viewings. People who had sworn off television news returned for 1 hour, then 2, then 3, measuring commentary against their memory of previous reckonings. A retired judge spoke to a library crowd and called the verdict a recalibration not of laws, but of courage. "Systems are just people standing in formation," she said. "We watch people stand." The applause that followed was polite at first, then full, then loud. While the print crowd clipped editorials, the under 30 crowd did what they do. They made edits of their own. TikTok filled with punchy, beautifully cut clips of Jasmine at the podium slam to silence, cut to verdict, crashed to her closing line about truth. Instagram reels layered her words over shots of Congress classrooms and kitchen tables, replacing the soundtrack of cynicism with drums of resolve. Dance creators left their beats and posted stitched reactions instead, tears clenched fists, simple captions that read, "Thank you." The view counters rolled like odometers on an open highway, numbers folding into numbers until the clips felt like they belonged to everyone. Student groups rebranded their weekly meetings and stamped flyers with a single image, a microphone standing upright like a pillar. They hosted teach-ins titled Speech Power and Consequence, bringing in public defenders, debate coaches, and speech therapists to talk about harm you can't see on skin. Digital citizenship went from a dorm buzzword to a campus priority, with labs mapping how mockery migrates and mutates online. At the end of each session, moderators asked the same question: how do we argue like citizens, not combatants? Hands went up. Ideas poured out. A new grammar was being drafted in real time. The education beat found its story and ran it hard. Superintendents put out memos nudging principals to address civic language in assemblies without sliding into partisanship. English teachers pulled courtroom transcripts to show rhetoric's power to heal or harm. Social studies teachers built mini-units, tracing lines from McCarthy's censure to modern ethics rules. In one crowded hallway, a laminated poster went up with Jasmine's words in bold print: "Freedom of speech is a right, but dignity is the boundary, and justice is the guardian of that boundary." Students took selfies beside it as if it were a monument, because for them it was. Parents noticed the shift at home. Dinner tables that had gone quiet during election seasons found their voices again. A mother asked her son to read the poster quote out loud. He did, and then asked what boundary meant if no one enforces it. His father answered, "It means we don't cheer when people are cut down. We cheer when arguments stand up." The boy nodded, and the conversation moved from rules to reasons, which is where civics lives when it's done right. Back in Congress, the debate reached its most delicate point: penalties. You cannot legislate kindness, one member warned, but you can legislate standards. Another shot back: if we can censure theft of time and money, we can censure the theft of dignity. Amendments were traded like chess moves, carve-outs for satire, safe harbors for good faith error, an appeals process that would keep the rules from becoming a cudgel. The language that emerged was cautious, but it was a language. And language, not silence, is how democracies correct themselves. Editorial pages kept the pressure on with columns that read like closing arguments to the nation. "This is not the end of free speech," one wrote. "It is the end of free cruelty." A libertarian voice countered, "Be careful, hard cases make bad rules." The next day, a First Amendment scholar split the difference. Hard cases make careful rules if we write them slowly and enforce them with humility. The public did something rare: they sat with nuance and did not sprint to rage. In state houses, copycat resolutions appeared, some symbolic, some serious. A governor announced a task force on political toxicity. A mayor unveiled a training for city council decorum and public comment nights. None of it could touch the scale of Congress, but all of it added up to a national echo. The message carried from marble to brick to cinder block. The country was not just reading about dignity, it was rehearsing it. Across talk, radio, and podcasts, hosts found unusual common ground. A libertarian said, "If the state doesn't restrain you, the jury just might." A progressive said, "If decency won't restrain you, the rule book will." A centrist said, "We need arenas where we fight, but we don't maim." Callers phoned in with stories of being mocked in city halls and school boards, and for once, the hosts didn't race to score points, they listened. It felt less like programming and more like group therapy for a wounded republic. The images kept coming: classrooms with new posters, church signs with old verses about the tongue town halls, with fresh rules taped to the door. In one photo that went viral, a teenage girl in a varsity jacket stood at a lectern in front of her school board. Her hands shook, but her voice didn't. "Freedom of speech is a right," she read, "but dignity is the boundary, and justice is the guardian of that boundary." The room applauded softly at first, then louder. No one asked who she was. Everyone knew. Back in the Capitol's special session, the chair summarized the record with a voice that sounded worn and honest. "We are not here to police opinions," he said. We are here to police ourselves. He looked down at the stack of exhibits, verdicts, transcripts, victim statements, and then out at the chamber. We will disagree tomorrow as fiercely as we did yesterday, but from this day we will do it without throwing acid. The vote that followed was closer than advocates wanted and wider than cynics predicted. For the older generation, the moment slotted into a familiar frame, a nation correcting its aim after drifting. We've done this before, an old newscaster said on a retrospective clips of Watergate rolling behind him. We will do it again and again because self-government is a practice, not a prize. He smiled sadly the way veterans of hard fights do when they see the next generation step forward. At home, retirees folded their papers satisfied and set their alarms for the morning session. For the young, the moment glowed like a neon sign that said permission granted. They posted organized, registered, and repeated Jasmine's lines like a chorus. Classes formed around the verdict. Internships listed it in their prompts. Scholarships asked applicants what boundary meant to them. The clips kept climbing, and then they plateaued somewhere beyond counting, because culture is not a number, it is a temperature. And the temperature had changed. By the time the special session wrapped its first week, the phrase had moved from posters to practice. Freedom of speech is a right, but dignity is the boundary, and justice is the guardian of that boundary. It appeared in opening statements, in school announcements, in the sidebars of ethics manuals, and in the quiet prefaces people spoke before they disagreed. The line did not end argument. It steadied it. It did not cool passion. It redirected it. What began as a verdict had become a vocabulary. Congress, the media, the elders, the young, each had found a way to carry the same message in their own dialects. The country was not cured, but it was awake. And as the gavel fell to close the special session, the echo did not sound like a period. It sounded like a promise kept. The noise that began in America did not stop at the water's edge. It crossed oceans like a shockwave. As dawn reached London, Tokyo, and Doha, producers bumped lighter stories and built emergency rundowns around a single headline. On-air anchors spoke with the gravity usually reserved for wars and state funerals, and lower thirds flashed a name that felt both new and inevitable, the 109 silence case. Correspondents stood before glowing maps and explained in plain language how a courtroom had redrawn the border between speech and harm. Viewers watched the clips, Johnson's sneer, Jasmine's stillness, the verdict, and understood the stakes without needing translation. The world had seen many American scandals before, but this one arrived with something rarer, a clean line, and a clear lesson. The BBC opened with a montage that moved like a quick-cut documentary, the gavel, the gasp, the verdict card stamped across the screen. Its presenter called it a legal drama with constitutional consequences and repeated the title, now circulating in every newsroom, the 100 silence case. NHK followed with a quieter tone, but a firm frame explaining how public humiliation can be weighed like damage, and how a jury, not a minister, had set the scale. Al Jazeera widened the lens, linking the case to global debates about speech and dignity in parliaments, from Westminster to the Knesset. Across all three, the same phrase kept returning, not mocked, not questioned, but used as a shared shorthand, the 100 silence case. For a rare moment, the world agreed on both the name and the meaning. Segments multiplied. The BBC booked a former speaker from another country to ask how chambers survive when cruelty becomes a currency. NHK interviewed a Japanese labor lawyer who noted that harassment policies in companies had long treated words as real harm, and politics was finally catching up. Al Jazeera assembled a roundtable of scholars from 3 continents who argued calmly and forcefully that freedom and restraint are not sworn enemies, but tense neighbors. Each program ran the same video of Jasmine raising a hand to take her oath, and each program left it on screen a breath longer than usual. The pause did more than words. It let viewers feel the difference between performance and principle. The story had scaled past shock and settled into significance. Universities moved just as quickly, though, in a different register. At Harvard Law School, a dean sent a late-night email titled "Immediate Curriculum Update," and by morning, a new seminar had a waiting list stretching down the hallway. Yale folded the case into a speech and civic harm module, pairing the verdict with classic First Amendment opinions and asking students to draw a living map of the limits. Oxford's tutorial sheets arrived with a blunt prompt: can dignity be priced without chilling debate? Argue from precedent, Argue from principle. Casebooks grew a fresh spine label. Crockett v. Johnson and students underlined passages with the focus that comes when you know history is writing itself under your pen. Professors called it a teaching gift, not because it was simple, but because it was clean enough to argue honestly. Moot court teams rehearsed cross-examinations, and corridors buzzed like trading floors of ideas. The first symposia felt like live theater. Panels blended constitutional lawyers with sociolinguists, ethics scholars with practitioners who had sat in real chambers and heard real slurs. One student stood and said, voice shaking but certain, if we can weigh broken bones, we can weigh broken standing. Another pushed back, but who holds the scale? The room didn't boo or cheer. It debated line by line until someone wrote on a whiteboard the sentence that would become the seminar's North Star. Freedom draws the arena, dignity draws the out-of-bounds line. When the session ended, nobody rushed for the exit. They lingered like people who had glimpsed a framework sturdy enough to live inside. Law had grown a new room and students were already furnishing it. Global human rights organizations spoke with unusual unity and speed. Their statements did not read like scolding manifestos. They read like relief. A constitutional democracy proves its health not by avoiding injury, one message declared, but by healing it in public. Another said plainly, courts cannot make people kind, but they can make cruelty expensive. Press conferences echoed with a phrase that had felt corny a decade ago and felt earned now rule of law. Reporters asked whether the verdict should be exported, codified, adapted. The advocates answered with care, no copy-paste, but yes to the principle that power owes restraint. The applause in those rooms was not wild. It was steady like rain that promises growth. Then came the image that would outlast every headline. A photographer had stood at the edge of the well when Jasmine raised her right hand to swear the oath, the courtroom lights, blazing, the seal gleaming behind her. The frame captured a geometry of resolved fingers, straight chin, level eyes forward, no triumph, only duty. Time put it on its cover, without a burst or a pun, the red border doing its quiet work around a portrait that could have been taken in 1964 or 2064. Newsstands turned into little galleries and commuters paused not to read first but to look. The cover moved through airports and living rooms like a visiting monument, and for a few weeks the magazine felt less like a magazine and more like a certificate. Other outlets followed with their own tributes, but none matched the stillness of that shot. A French weekly printed a foldout with the caption, "Silence Priced." A Brazilian paper ran a front-page sketch of the oath hand as a column holding up the words, "Honra" and "Lay." In Nairobi, a broadcaster opened with a montage of women raising their hands in courts and councils, overlaying Jasmine's image at the center, then fading to a caption, "Different tongues, same vow." The photograph's power was not that it glorified a person, it standardized a posture. Every time someone took an oath on camera after that, the audience subconsciously measured it against the line of her wrist and the calm of her gaze. Symbols work because we let them, and the world decided to let this one. The long tail arrived not with fireworks but with friction. Politicians across democracies called staff meetings, where comms chiefs used a new phrase, pre-litigation filter, and speechwriters trimmed flourishes that used to draw cheap cheers. Debate did not die, it sobered. The best retail politicians turned sharper on policy and lighter on poison, discovering that precision could pierce louder than insult. A few bristled publicly, testing the margins with performative sneers, and discovered that donors, editors, and even friendly hosts now flinched. The incentives had been rewired not by law alone, but by the memory of a jury's number ringing like a bell. Inside party caucuses, elders told younger members what elders rarely admit. "I was wrong to cheer that line. I was lazy to swing low. We can win without Ash." Clips resurfaced, apologies followed, and some voters shrugged while others nodded, because contrition is a language that when spoken plainly still translates. Ethics committees updated pamphlets with a section that did not exist last year. Identity-targeted degradation in official speech. The bullet points were dry and legal, the thrust was not. "We will sanction you for swinging beneath the belt you swore to wear." New members signed acknowledgments along with office keys and parking permits. The culture changed because the paperwork changed and because the cameras kept receipts. For ordinary people, the verdict did something rarer than when a news cycle, it adjusted belief. Talk show callers who once defaulted to cynicism began saying, maybe this is fixable, or maybe the rules are awake. Community mediators cited the case in school assemblies and union halls, not to threaten lawsuits, but to teach the physics of respect. Words have mass, and when thrown, they do impact. Couples argued about it over dinner and somehow argued better. Kids repeated the new sentence in classrooms and somehow teased less. The story that had started as a headline became a habit. That is the only kind of victory that lasts. Educators translated the moment into lesson plans. In a ninth grade civics class, a teacher brought the time cover and a printout of the verdict's key paragraphs. She asked two questions. What did the jury say happened, and what did the jury say it cost? The first answer came fast: humiliation. The second took longer because numbers that large tangle the tongue. Finally, a student raised his hand and said, it cost enough to make it stop. The class wrote that on a poster and tacked it above the door, where it caught in the breeze each time students came and went. They treated it like a guard at the threshold. Abroad, parliaments watched with the wary interest neighbors save for each other's house fires. Some copied nothing and copied everything, no bills but new norms enforced by chairs who cut the mic more often and earlier. In one chamber, a leader announced, we will finish every debate, and then paused, but not at the cost of a colleague's name. It sounded small until members tried it and discovered how much oxygen it freed. In another, a backbencher attempted a viral insult and found his party whip waiting afterward with a plain envelope, a warning, a suspension, a path back that required a real apology. Everyone read the memo. Everyone understood the math. Back in the United States, the case citation appeared in places no one expected. A corporate handbook footnoted it under workplace dignity. A public library pasted a line from the jury instructions beside its code of conduct. A county clerk printed a poster that read, we serve everyone. We belittle no one, and credited Crockett v. Johnson beneath it like a source text. Some called this performative, others called it prophylactic. Either way, reasons multiplied for people in power to check the temperature of their tongues before stepping to a microphone. Cool heads began to win primes they used to lose. The most visible change, though, lived in small interactions. Local council meetings that once spiraled into insult now hit guardrails and steered back to potholes and permits. A high school board member who loved to grandstand learned to aim at policy and found to his surprise that the room clapped longer when he did. A radio host who built a career on cutting callers off began letting them finish. These were not flowers blooming all at once. They were habits hardening as habits do, one ordinary hour at a time. The law had not made anyone kind, but it had made unkindness cost more than it paid. And through every replay, every syllabus, every panel and poster, the simplest outcome endured. Politicians grew careful with their words, not timid, not tamed, but deliberate, because sloppiness had finally met a consequence. Voters in turn relearned a premise they had nearly given up on, that honor is not a museum piece. It can be defended in the present tense. It can be valued without being vague. It can be protected by rules that do not silence speech, but draw a boundary where speech becomes a weapon. As the coverage widened and then cooled, those lines remained visible to anyone who looked. In living rooms from Cleveland to Cape Town, people pointed at the screen when the oath hand photo appeared and said to their children, this is what standing looks like. In classrooms from Boston to Bangalore, students underlined a new case name and wrote in the margin price of humiliation, Turkish deterrence. And in green rooms and whip meetings and offices with flags, leaders rehearsed lines that stayed on the right side of the boundary. The case did not cure the world. It did something better for a democracy built on argument. It made the arena safer for the next fight. In the long run, that is how faith returns, when dignity stops being a speech and starts being the rule. The cameras were still rolling when the chamber fell into silence once more. Jasmine stood steady at the podium, the crowd behind her, still buzzing from the verdict, the flashes still burning her face. She raised her voice not for triumph, but for clarity, and the words seemed to vibrate against the walls. In a democracy, truth and dignity are never silenced. No matter how powerful someone may be, they will bow before justice. Her tone was measured, her eyes unwavering, and in that instant it felt less like a statement and more like a verdict delivered to history itself. The audience leaned forward, every ear straining, as if they might never hear a moment this raw again. Reporters froze mid-keystroke, letting the weight of her words land before they wrote them down. Some supporters broke into tears, clutching one another, as though the promise had been written for them personally. Across the aisle, even opponents could not disguise the shift in the room. The atmosphere pulsed with a single idea. Dignity was not abstract anymore. It was alive, visible, enforceable. The words echoed like a drumbeat impossible to ignore. Outside the courthouse, the message replayed on giant screens, in cafes, on phones clutched by strangers. Crowds repeated it in unison, a chant that carried down streets and up marble steps. Truth and dignity are never silenced. The phrase became more than a headline. It became a vow whispered by parents to children, by teachers to students, by citizens to one another. The clarity cut through the noise of politics, striking with the force of something elemental, something everyone recognized deep down, but had needed to hear out loud. Jasmine had said it for all of them, and the world had listened. The gavel had fallen, the case was closed, but this line stood apart, suspended like a banner over the entire story. It was not about Jasmine alone, nor about Johnson's fall. It was about the principle that had been tested and had survived. As the crowd dispersed and the lights dimmed, the words kept traveling, carried in headlines and conversations, in the quiet determination of a nation reminded of its core. And with that, the chapter sealed itself not with silence, but with a promise spoken in full voice. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.